scholar. Many years ago, when I was a graduate student at Harvard, my teacher there, Patrick Hannan, he admired Professor Riftin. So he told me that I must learn Russian in order to read Boris Riftin's book. But I didn't learn Russian. So please forgive me for not speaking Russian. I hope, I'm very embarrassed that I don't speak Russian, especially since I have such excellent students who speak Russian, like Eric here, I see his name, and Olga. I have wonderful colleagues who speak Russian. And in fact, my own family came partly from Russia. My grandmother came to Israel or Palestine 100 years ago in the 1920s from Russia, from Latvia. They came from Latvia. So in fact, my grandmother spoke Russian, and my mother, who is now 95 years old, she still speaks Russian, but I don't speak Russian. So please forgive me for not understanding your wonderful lectures in Russian, and forgive me for speaking in English. So can you let me share the screen? And okay, can you see this? Can you
Yes,
see my
yes.
okay, so that's good. So you can see it. Okay, so I will begin with a legend with which you are probably all familiar. This is the most famous Chinese love story. It is the love story of the heavenly weaving maiden, the fairy, and the herd boy. According to the legend, you're probably familiar with it. There was once a very beautiful fairy in heaven. She embroidered the, the bright sunset clouds in the skies, and she lived in heaven. And on earth, there was a very, very poor herd boy, a very, very poor boy who had nothing in the world other than an old ox. He only had an old ox. And he was so poor that he could not hope ever to get married. But one day the ox opened its mouth, and the ox said, listen, the fairies from heaven are going to go down to earth. There, he pointed at some place, and you should go there when they come down from heaven. They are going to bathe, they are going to take a bath in a pond. You should steal the clothes of one of them, and when she asks for her clothes, you demand that she marries you. And this way, you will obtain a wife, and not just any wife, but a heavenly maiden. So this poor boy, the herd boy, he did as the ox said, and he stole the clothes of this beautiful fairy, and he asked her to marry him, and they got married, and they were really happy together, and they even had two children, a nice boy and a nice girl, and they were very, very happy. All until one day, the queen mother of the West in heaven, she's a great goddess in the heavens, she noticed that the clouds, the evening clouds, are not colored anymore. So she got really angry that the fairy, this weaving maiden, descended to earth, eloped to earth, and she sent heavenly soldiers to take the weaving maiden back to heaven. So our poor herd boy was left once again without a wife. But once again, it was the ox that saved him. The ox opened its mouth again, and the ox said, listen, I, the ox, am going to die. And when I die, you you take my skin, you tear my skin, yes, you skin me, you take my skin, you wrap yourself in my skin, and I will carry you to heaven, where you will meet again your beloved weaving maiden. So our hero did it. Yes, he wrapped himself in the skin of the ox and he flew to the heavens. And well, it's a complicated story. He didn't exactly meet her, but he almost met her in heaven. Yeah, he became a star on one side of the Milky Way, and the weaving maiden became another star, and they meet every year on the Chinese Valentine Day. Now, the point of the story, the principal characters in the story are, of course, the herd boy and the weaving maiden. But I'm interested in a third party. I'm interested in the ox. It's very clear that the ox, or the bull, also came down from heaven. In fact, The stories suggest that the ox descended from heaven for the express purpose of helping our poor herd boy find a wife. Yes. So in other words, we have here a story in which the animal, the draft animal, the ox, is a god who descended from heaven to help the peasant, help him find a wife. And this idea, the idea that the ox is in fact a god that came down from heaven to help us people cultivate the land, this idea was very widespread in late imperial China. That is to say, from the 10th century onwards. We find this idea in works of literature, in plays, in novels, in folk tales, and in religious literature, both Buddhist-oriented literature and Taoist-oriented literature. And this idea, the idea that the ox is a god, is the subject of my lecture today, of my brief lecture today. It's going to be rather brief, not a full hour, I think. One important comment before I proceed. If you look at this painting here, you see that the animal that I called in English ox is in fact not an ox, it's a buffalo. Do you notice this? It is in fact the animal that plows the rice field of South China. So just notice this. In Chinese, the same word, niu, applies both to the ox that plows the wheat fields of North China and to the buffalo that plows the rice fields of South China. And in fact, I think that when Chinese people think about this legend, they usually think about a buffalo. So the animal that is a god, the animal that descended from heaven, is often considered to be the buffalo, not the ox. It's both ox and buffalo, but often it's the buffalo, okay? So here you have it, what I just told you. Yes, when we are talking about this animal that is a god, it might be the buffalo here on top left, or it might be the ox here on bottom right. So now this legend, before I proceed, I will tell you about the origins of this legend. Of course, what's beautiful about this legend is that it is an expression of gratitude. Chinese peasants were so grateful to the animal that helped them plow the land that they considered this animal, they imagined that this animal is a god. So in a way, this legend is an expression of gratitude, a gratitude of humans to the animals that help them and work with them. One moment, please. Please forgive me. Okay. Now, okay. Now, I told you that this legend was very widespread in various genres, and I will begin with ritual scriptures from rural China. Scriptures that you can find that ritual masters in villages across China, but mainly in South China, use. So let us see the next slide. What you see here, I think. Okay, you can see here the fourth person from left is the organizer of this conference. Yes, Olga Mazu. Do you see her? Here she is. Here is Olga. And next to Olga is me. And next to us is this Fashe, this ritual master. Last month, in September, early September, we traveled to China. We had a wonderful trip in Guizhou province in South China. And you can see here our entire team. And what we did in Guizhou province, we scanned or photographed texts that are used by local ritual masters, such as this guy here standing next to me. He is a village ritual master. And we collected many texts. This is, for example, a text that we found just last month. And the text is addressed to a god called Niowang, that is to say, Ox King. And the text, the peasants, they pray to this god, to the Ox King, to help them protect their draft animals, to help them protect their oxen and their buffaloes. Yes. So there is a god, the Ox King, and it is his job to protect the buffaloes that plow the rice fields or the oxen, and the peasants pray to this god. And we collected such scriptures of prayer to this god, the ox king. Now, what is interesting is, here, let me see, this is another example. It says, you know, for sure, Niu Wang, Miao Jing, that is to say, the miraculous scripture of the ox king spoken by the Buddha. So you see, it's a Buddhist-oriented text. And what these scriptures say is that the ox king, this god, is not only in heaven. He doesn't only protect the animals from heaven. He is, in fact, incarnate in the animals themselves. These scriptures describe the ox king as a bodhisattva, a Buddhist deity, in Chinese Pusa, and this bodhisattva is incarnate in the bodies of the animals that he protects. So here we can read a little bit from this scripture. At that time, the great strengths, I have here a problem. 1 second, please forgive me. Okay, anyway, at that time, the great strength ox king, or the great strength bodhisattva, emerged from his seat. Pressing his palms in reverence, he addressed the Buddha, saying, "World-honored one, I've made up my mind to become a Buddha. I've long seen the people of the mortal world struggling in fields. With their 10 fingers, they claw at the mud until the blood flows. I pledge to be born in an ox body. I vow to save the people." So what you see here is this idea that the god that is in heaven, he's a bodhisattva, he decided to come down to earth to help us plow the land. Now, this great strength bodhisattva, please notice this name, great strength bodhisattva. That's how they call the god, the Dali Pusa, or Dali Nyowang Pusa. This great strength bodhisattva has only one worry. What is it? I only worry that because of people's accumulated evil karma, they will prize my robust flesh and skin. They will slaughter me, peel off my skin, and consume my flesh. Hence, they will be punished in hell with no possibility of redemption. So here we see, and this is important, we see a connection between the divinity of the animal. The animal is a god, and therefore it is forbidden to eat its flesh. Those who eat buffalo meat or ox meat are going to be punished in hell. Yes, and in fact, the beef taboo, in Chinese it's called Niujie, was very widely observed during the late imperial period in China. All through the early 20th century, many Chinese people, perhaps most, especially in South China, did not eat beef. And this is because, or it's related to the legend, that the ox or the buffalo is in fact a god, and it's blasphemous to eat its meat. So here, for example, you have a painting from Taiwan, from a temple in Taiwan. And what you see here is, it's a picture of the place where, according to Chinese belief, we will all go to one day. It's the netherworld court, yes. That's where people go to after they die. And there they are being judged for their crimes or for their good things, yes. And this poor guy who is kneeling here is being punished for the slaughter of a buffalo. He is shown his crime in the karma mirror, Jing, and you can see him watching. He's shown his old self in the act of axing a buffalo, of killing a buffalo. And for this, he's being punished in hell. So the animal is a god, and therefore it is forbidden to eat its flesh, okay? The animal is a god, he is a bodhisattva. You know, of course, that in Buddhism, a bodhisattva is a god that sacrifices itself for others. So this is exactly what this great strength bodhisattva that we find in late imperial Chinese scripture does. He sacrifices himself for us. He becomes an animal. Now, one additional comment. I said that the ox king, who is incarnated in the oxen, the animal is in fact a bodhisattva, in some scriptures, he's identified with the most loved Chinese bodhisattva. You are all familiar with her. She is, of course, Guanyin, or Avalokiteshvara in Sanskrit. She is the most famous, the most loved Chinese bodhisattva, Chinese goddess. So there is this idea that, in fact, the ox is Guanyin. And this is why in southwest China, in Sichuan province, for example, the ox king is depicted as Guanyin seated upon, mounted upon a buffalo. This is what you see here. So this is in fact the goddess that protects buffaloes and oxen. And according to the legend, she is present in the very bodies of these animals. Okay, so just remember this image. We will come back to it later. I will try to argue that this image was influenced by Indian art, by the images of Shiva seated upon a buffalo. I don't know if you know this, but there are many scholars who argue that Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, is in fact the Buddhist Shiva, is in fact a Buddhist manifestation of Shiva. And we can see this in the image of the buffalo-mounted Guanyin. But I'll go back to this later. Okay. Now, in some, I won't go much into this, but I just told you that the animal is a god, and usually the divinity of the animal is articulated in Buddhist terms. That is to say, we are told that the animal is a bodhisattva, just the passage that we just read, yes? That he is a bodhisattva, that is a Buddhist god who descended from heaven. But some scriptures, some texts describe the divinity of the animal in other terms. For example, they don't use Buddhist terminology, they don't use the Buddhist language, but they might say that the ox is a star that descended from heaven. You know that among the constellations of the stars, one of the Chinese constellations is the constellation of the ox. It's called Niu Xiu in Chinese. So what they are saying is that, in fact, the animal that plows the land is a star that descended from heaven. And this is an example. Those of you who read Chinese can see it very clearly. Yes, in the third line, 父牛者上阴天星，下为低处. That is to say, in heaven, the ox corresponds to a heavenly star. On earth, the ox is a draft animal, is an animal. Okay, so they use the language of astronomy to describe the divinity of the animal. And some scriptures, which are influenced by Taoism, describe the animal in terms of Taoist divine beings. One of the most important Taoist gods is called the dark warrior or true warrior, Xuanwu or Zhenwu. It is a very, very important Taoist god. And he's the god of the north. And the constellation of the ox that I just mentioned is located in the northern sky. So the dark warrior, this Taoist god, supervises the constellation of the ox. And that's why I think that this god became associated with the animal. So here you have an example of a very popular late imperial scripture that was written by spirit handwriting, by the way. It's a divine revelation. And what it says is, in heaven, the ox is the essence of the dark warrior. So what the text says, in fact, is that the animal is a Taoist god, not a Buddhist god, a Taoist god. He is the dark warrior, okay? So the animal is in any event a god. Sometimes they describe it, most often they describe it in Buddhist terms, but sometimes in astral terms, in terms of astronomy, and sometimes in Taoist terms. Now the big question is, where did this come from? Where did this idea of the animal as a god, of the draft animal, of the ox as a god, come from? By the way, I was interested just now in the lecture that we just heard by Agalia Starostina. I apologize for not knowing Russian, but she just mentioned that there are bulls also in the caves, in the treasure caves, yes? So again, you find this idea that the bull or the ox is a god, is associated with immortality and the god. So the question is, where did this idea come from? And what I will try to convince you is that this idea that we find during the late imperial period, say the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century onwards in China, this idea is traceable to the medieval period. We can find it during the Tang period. It is traceable to Buddhist scriptures. So the origins are Buddhist. And furthermore, what I will suggest, I don't know if I will have enough time to go and talk much about this, I will suggest that this idea originated in India. That is to say, I will suggest that the divinity of the Chinese ox is related to the sanctity of the Indian cow. I don't know if among you there are Indian specialists, but if there are, you can correct me and we can talk about this. So I will now start the journey backward in time. I'm leaving the late imperial period. I'm going to the medieval period, the Tang period, the 8th, 9th, 10th century in China, and I will try to convince you that already during that period in Chinese Buddhism, we find the idea of the divinity of the ox. By the way, the ox, as you can see here, was also is a very popular topic of Chinese art, yes? And this is not incidental, because the Chinese love the buffalo so much that they also paint it. Yeah, some of the greatest Chinese painters paint the ox or the buffalo. Okay, so I'll begin with Chan Buddhism. I imagine that you are all familiar with this school of Buddhism, the Buddhist school of Chan, known usually by its Japanese name, Zen Buddhism or Chan Buddhism. In Chan Buddhism, the ox serves as a metaphor for the enlightened mind, a metaphor for the Buddha nature that is inherent in each and every one of us. So in each and every one of us, there is an ox that is capable of enlightenment. So here you have an example. This is from the 8th century, a Buddhist master. His student asks him, I'm in search of the Buddha, but I do not yet know how to continue my quest. So this person is searching for the Buddha, but he doesn't know how to search. So Baizhang answered, in general, it is as if one were looking for an ox on which one is riding. So the ox is a metaphor for enlightenment and a metaphor for the hidden enlightenment in each of us. And this idea later, by the Song period, by the 11th and 12th century, became very, very popular in Buddhist art. I don't know if you are familiar with these paintings of the metaphor of searching for the ox. This series of paintings depict the process of self-cultivation, of searching for enlightenment, searching for Buddhahood, and the whole process is described in terms of searching for an ox and then taming the ox, and finally becoming one with the ox. So here, the way it goes from top left. That's when one is unenlightened, and the ox is dark, is black. And then from top left, we go right, and then we end on bottom right, when the ox and the person disappear into the circle. The circle is also a symbol of enlightenment. And the ox, in the process, change color. Excuse me, I drink some water. The ox, in the process, change color from black to white. So, so in short, the ox is a metaphor for Buddhahood. But some texts, this is from Japan, searching for the ox in Japanese art. And by the 20th century, by the way, this parable of searching for the ox became also popular in the West. Suzuki, the Japanese Buddhist scholar, translated the parable of searching for the ox into English, and it became also very popular in the West. There are many Western authors allude to it. So as early as the Tang period, Chinese Buddhists use the ox as metaphor for the Buddha, but some texts go further. They actually argue that the animal, it's not a metaphor, but the animal itself is a Buddha, or the animal itself is a god. So here you have an example from the 10th century. You have here someone, villagers, and if you read what I translated in red, what the people of this world are eating is all due to the labors of this yellow herd bodhisattva, Huang Mao Pusa. The yellow herd bodhisattva is the ox. By the way, here clearly he's talking about an ox, not about a buffalo, because he mentions that it's yellow fur, so it's actually the ox. I should have actually begun a sentence earlier. This guy, we are told, these villagers objected to the slaughter of cattle. That is to say, he was very angry when people slaughtered cattle. And what did he say? He said, what we are eating is all due to the labor of this cattle, of this yellow herd bodhisattva. He's responsible for agricultural production. Nonetheless, in the end, people kill it. So again, what we see here in this 10th century text is that the ox is a god, he's a bodhisattva, a Buddhist god, and it's forbidden to eat its flesh. So the divinity of the animal is related to the prohibition of its flesh. So here you have, this is a 10th century painting discovered in Dunhuang, in Chinese Central Asia. This is from the 10th century. The painting I showed you earlier was from the 19th century or early 20th century, but it's the exact same thing. Someone is being punished in hell for he's shown in the karma mirror his crime, and the crime is that of ox slaughter. He's shown his former self in the act of axing an ox. So as early as the 10th century, there are these people who think that the animal is a god, and therefore it's forbidden. Now let us see an even more striking example. This text was discovered in Dunhuang. It was discovered by a great, not by me. It was discovered, I mean, the text was discovered by Pelliot, yes, and taken to the French National Library. But the person who noticed this is a good friend of mine, Imre Galambos. I don't know if you know the name. He's a great scholar. He's now in China, actually. He taught at Cambridge. Now he's at Zhejiang University. And what the text says is, Nyo Shedali Pusa, the ox is the great strength bodhisattva. This is from the 10th century. It is exactly what we find 900 years later in Chinese text that I showed you earlier. Namely that the ox is, they use the same word, great strength bodhisattva. The same idea as early as the 10th century. Now let us go further back. And I'm showing you now a text that was written in the late 7th or early 8th century by a Korean monk who was writing in Chinese in China. And we find here the same idea that the ox is a god, but what is interesting is this monk is talking about Hinduism, not about Buddhism. So look at this. What he says is, according to the non-Buddhists, why Tao? By non-Buddhists, he means the Hindus, what we would nowadays call the Hindus. Say that at the beginning of the Kalpa, in any way, the people had nothing to eat. The people were starved. The gods, Zhu Tian. Tian here in Chinese is a translation of the Sanskrit Deva. So the Devas, the gods of Hinduism, took pity on the people that had nothing to eat and transformed themselves into oxen who plowed with the sentient beings. And thus the sentient beings were able to survive. So we find the same idea, the idea that the animal is a god, but here this Korean Buddhist monk, culturally Chinese, is attributing this idea to India. And I think he's right. I think this idea that the ox is a god actually came to China with Buddhism from India. Now, please note the last sentence, that today cow dung and urine are considered pure in the West is because of these gods. So, as you all know, in India to this day, cow dung is considered pure and it is used in religious rituals. So this is the fact to this very day in India. And it is for the very same reason, because the animal is a god. So just to remind us of the situation in India, here you have a painting of the entire Hindu pantheon, all the gods of Hinduism inside the body of the cow, which is a sacred animal in India. In front of the cow is Yama, and he is told that those who protect the cow, he can't harm them. He can't harm those who protect the cow. And below, you see that all the people of India are being fed by the cow, by the milk of the cow. There are 4 people here. This is from the, perhaps reflecting the British colonial period. So there's a British person and the Hindu person and the Farsi person and the Muslim person, 4 people representing the various population of India, and they all depend upon the sacred cow. So the Chinese monks were fully aware. Chinese monks of the medieval period knew very well that in India, the cow was sacred. And they further knew that the sanctity of that this idea that that the cow is sacred, this Indian idea, non-Buddhist idea, was adopted by Buddhism and brought by Buddhism to China. So here you have an example by an influential Chinese Buddhist scholar called Dao Shi, who lived in the 7th century. And he wrote a very large encyclopedia, Buddhist encyclopedia called Fairan Junin. It's a huge encyclopedia of Buddhism. And in this encyclopedia, the encyclopedia includes magic recipes for success in various things. And there is also a recipe to bring down the rain if there is no rain, if there is a drought. So what do you do? There is a recipe for bringing down the rain. And in this recipe, what you have to do is you have to take cow feces, the excrement of the cow dung, and you have to draw a dragon with it, a naga with it, and then there will be rain. So for Chinese people, this perhaps was very strange, yes. So this Chinese Buddhist scholar, Dao Shi, he had to explain it to the Chinese readers. And how does he explain it? He says, in the lands of the West, the ox plows the land, yielding the myriad foodstuffs. Therefore, the people commonly consider its excrement pure. Why is the excrement of the cow pure? Because this animal is very important. They build temples. So these Chinese monks write about India. They build temples where Brahma, Indra, and the cow are worshipped together. So he's describing Hinduism. But now he goes on to speak of Buddhism. Buddhism followed this popular sentiment, likewise accepting cow dung as pure. You see? So here we have it very clearly. Buddhism adopted the sanctity of the cow from the surrounding Hindu culture. Okay. I hope that you're all okay. Okay. Now I'll just give a few examples of the importance of cattle in Buddhism before I conclude. A few examples how Buddhism accords special sanctity to the cow. And the first example concerns the Buddha himself. One of the most common epithets of the Buddha is bull of a man, Nara Rishabha. This is how they speak of the Buddha. The Buddha is called Nara Rishabha, bull of a man. So the bull is a sacred animal, and the Buddha himself, Shakyamuni, is called bull of a man. It is interesting that this Nara Rishabha was translated into Chinese as Niowang, ox king. I don't know if you remember, but early in my talk, I mentioned a god that Olga and me, we found in scriptures in South China, a god called Niowang, ox king. This is actually, this comes from Buddhism. In Buddhism, the Buddha himself is called Nyowa. Okay, so this is one example of how important, of the importance that Buddhism accords the ox or the bull. Okay, this is in Hinduism. I don't, you'll find it a little funny, perhaps. This is from Amazon, India. I found it online. You can buy cow dung online if you're interested. If you want, you can buy boom boom hole, organic, holy, homemade, pure India Desi cow dung. You can buy it on Amazon, so, and use it in religious ritual. They said it's holy. But the point is that in fact, the Chinese Buddhist canon, that includes translation from the Sanskrit and other Indian languages into Chinese, the Chinese Buddhist canon includes some 800 references to cow dung and urine. So in fact, it's very clear that Buddhism brought this idea of the sanctity of the animal and also of its bodily excrements into China. By the way, another substance of the cow that is very important and sacred in India and then also in China and Japan is bezoar. Bezoar are like stones that form inside the gall, inside the intestines of cattle. And they were considered sacred in India and in China and in Japan. Okay, now finally, Buddhism brought to China also many cow riding or ox riding gods. So this is, for example, Yama in a painting from Dunhuang from Chinese Central Asia. Yama standing on a buffalo, yes. So this idea of the sanctity of the animal is reflected in Hindu and later in Buddhist iconography. So here is one Buddhist god, Yama, standing on the buffalo. This is Yamantaka, the god that kills death. And he too rides a bull or a buffalo. But the most important bull riding Indian god is Shiva. Shiva is associated with the bull. Here you see Shiva in a painting from Khotan in Chinese Central Asia. You see the bulls underneath him. This is Shiva. This is Shiva's bull, which is called Nandi, being worshipped in India. The ox itself, or the bull itself, is an object of worship. And here you see Shiva mounted upon his bull in a statue from Sichuan province, from the Dazu caves in Sichuan province in southwest China. This is the exact same place and the same period when we first find the images of Guanyin mounted upon an ox. I don't know if you remember, I mentioned earlier that in South China, we have an image of Guanyin mounted upon an ox. These images appeared in the 10th century at the Dazu caves in Sichuan. And here you see Shiva mounted upon an ox, also at the Dazu caves a little bit earlier, like 50 years earlier, also at the Dazu caves. So there is a connection between Indian iconography, perhaps, and Chinese iconography. So to conclude, I think I've reached my conclusion. The concept of the divine ox and the concomitant prohibition of its flesh are traceable to ancient India. Buddhism served as a vehicle introducing the sanctity of the Indian cattle to China. And here you see Gandhi in this picture, yes, with a cow. Okay, I hope I wrote thank you correctly in Russian. Is this correct?
Yes, absolutely correct.
Okay, so that's Google Translate. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very, very much for such a wonderful lecture. I think that there are a lot of questions, so please ask. You can ask them in comments or just ask in voice. Yes, please.
I have two short questions. The first one is, well, in the pre-Buddhist time, the bull was the main sacrificial animal in China. And of course, it changed with time. And do you know, has it been reinterpreted somehow? I mean, is there any reflection upon the ceasing of using the ox as a sacrificial animal in the later literature after the Buddhism came to China?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And in fact, you know, the thrust of my lecture today was on the Buddhist influence. But the ox was very important in China even earlier, as you said, as you say correctly. And in China, all through the first centuries of the Common Era, oxen were eaten. They were eaten and they were sacrificed. You're right, and they were sacrificed. The point about ox sacrifice is that according to some ancient Chinese ritual texts, it is only the emperor who is allowed to sacrifice the ox. So the feudal lords are allowed to sacrifice the smaller animals like lambs or pigs. So they used it in the later period also to justify the beef taboo. You're not allowed to slaughter the animal, only the emperor is allowed. So there is a connection. So they connected the ritual scripture, the ancient ritual scriptures, to the Buddhist idea. Yes, there is a connection. One additional comment. Of course, the native people of South China, like the Miao, and these people, on the one hand, the animal is extremely important for them, the buffalo or the ox. The buffalo is extremely important. On the other hand, they sacrifice it. And when the Chinese came there, so they, in their attempt to civilize the barbarians, they tried to convince them not to sacrifice the buffalo, because only the emperor is allowed to sacrifice the buffalo.
Okay, and that was the answer to my second question. Yeah, the Miao traditions.
Yeah.
Because I've seen lots of pictures about contemporary festivals in Miao villages where the bulls, the buffaloes, are decorated with little red bows ready to be sacrificed.
Yes. There is also another thing in South China, which is actually interesting. There is sacrifice. There is a sacrifice of the buffalo, but there is also a holiday called Niujie in Chinese. And in the holiday, you give the buffaloes and the oxen a day off from their labor, and you give them special food, glutinous rice, and you take and wash them. It's a holiday of thanking the animal. And the Chinese people of South China and the native people share this holiday. So perhaps some of the pictures that you saw might be of this holiday.
Maybe.
And not of the sacrifice.
Maybe, probably. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Some other questions? Or I have, yes, Aglai, please. Yes.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. And I have a question. Is it
or there are some problems with audio?
That the depiction of Lao Tzu riding a buffalo is
Yeah. I'm not sure I heard the whole question. But you mentioned the image of Lao Tzu riding the buffalo. So you're of course right. There is this tradition that Lao Tzu departed China riding a buffalo, and you might find it entertaining that when I gave the same talk essentially that I gave now, I gave it in Chinese by Zoom to people in Sichuan province, and they were Taoist scholars, so they were a little angry. They said, no, this all comes from Taoism, not from Buddhism. And they said that Lao Tzu rides an ox. That's your question. But I don't know. Well, yes, he rides an ox, but I don't think that this is such an important element in the emergence of the Chinese beef taboo, or that this was the primary reason for the sanctity of the animal. But you are right that there is this motif of Lao Tzu departing on an ox. It emerges only sometime during the medieval period, perhaps under Buddhist influence. In the early versions, we are just told that Lao Tzu left China. There's no mention of an ox. The ox appears sometimes in the first centuries CE. I don't know, perhaps, as you suggest, perhaps under Buddhist influence.
Thank you. I also have a small question. You mentioned about Niu Wang, the horse king, as a deity, and maybe you can say some words about the temples of this king and the community of these temples and how it was organized. And is it still popular now in modern
You mean
China?
the horse king or the ox king?
Oh, sorry, ox king.
The ox king.
Ox,
So,
sorry.
So yeah, so there is in China also a god called Horse King Mao Wang that protects horses and donkeys and mules, and there is a god called Niu Wang that protects oxen and buffaloes. Okay, yes, there are temples for the Ox King. There are temples for the Ox King both in North China and in South China. In Shanxi province and in Shanxi province, there are large temples for the Ox King. They were studied also by a Russian scholar. I have her name. I quote her in my book. And she studied these temples. And I visited these temples as well. And there was this is in the north. In South China, there were also many, many temples. Most of them were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, yes. And one of the disappointing things for a scholar such as me, I look at the map, and I see many villages that are called Niu Wang Miao or Niu Wang Cun. The village is named after the temple that one existed for the god. And then I go to this village, but the temple is long destroyed and nothing is left. And sometimes they don't even remember why the village is called Niu Wang Cun or Niu Wang Miao. But in the past, yes, there were temples all over China. And as I just mentioned to Elisaveta, the major thing was the festival in honor of the animals, in honor of the buffaloes and the oxen. It was called Niujie. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Some other questions? And is the cult of Niu Wang, the Ox King, is still popular, or maybe in the south? Or
well, you know, like me, because you traveled with me, you know just as me. But thank you for asking the question. I think that it is largely forgotten. He's forgotten because people, not only because of the Cultural Revolution and all the changes in China, but both the Horse King Mao Wang and the Ox King Niu Wang, these gods are forgotten because people don't rely anymore on draft animals. They don't use these animals anymore. So because they don't have the animals, so the gods that protected these animals are forgotten. But thank you for your questions.
Elizaveta.
Yes, just one more question. Is this the celebration of the ox, the rituals in the ox temples when this was the live tradition? Was it a community thing, or was there ritual specialists needed to perform those rituals?
I think that both things. I think that on the one hand, it was a community thing. It was a community thing. It was a festival, like a festival for any other Chinese god. But on the other hand, there were certainly ritual masters, such as the one that I showed you in the pictures, who were invited. Also, their role was to prevent bovine disease. They were invited to heal sick cattle and to prevent bovine disease. So you know that one of the most common and most deadly diseases of cattle was rinderpest. There was such a disease up until the early 20th century. It was a very dangerous disease for cattle. And That's why rituals for the protection of the cattle were extremely important. And that's one reason why the ox king, the god, was very popular, and why we have so many scriptures, ritual scriptures, dedicated to this god for the protection of the animals. It's because of these diseases that the god cured or prevented.
And those ritual specialists, did they combine the medicine knowledge with the ritual knowledge, or it was just rituals?
So that's a good question, and I don't. You know what is the definition of a good question?
No answer. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the definition. So you know also the answer to this question. But look, I read some books by veterinarians of the Song period, the 12th century. There is a book, Long Shu, and other books on agriculture, and they were all cursing these ritual specialists. They said, so this is from the perspective of elite veterinarians, traditional elite Chinese scholars who had ideas how to protect the cattle, and they were angry that the ignorant peasants don't listen to them and invite instead ritual specialists or shamans to heal the animals. So there was a competition between elite scholars and ritual specialists. But I imagine, your question is very good. I imagine that some of these ritual specialists actually did have some knowledge. And perhaps in the villages, perhaps they did combine some folk medicine that was effective with ritual. I don't know. I just don't know.
And to add just one more dimension to the image of the ox in China, you mentioned the paintings. You mentioned them in connection with Chan Buddhism, but there is also the Wenjianhua tradition, the Wenjianhua painting tradition, when the image of the bull is sort of the image of the person of Confucian values, or the noble person, noble man, the embodiment of different kind of morals, something like that. I think in Song China it was a very popular plot in Song paintings, in South Song paintings.
And what is the term you
of oxen, of buffaloes.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It's an extremely common theme in literati painting. I think that what attracted artists, I'm not exactly referring to what you said. You're absolutely right. I think that artists were attracted. It is a fact that the buffalo is often taken care of by children. It is a very gentle animal. And a huge animal can be led or can be ridden by a tiny little child. A little child can ride this huge animal. So that's one reason why this motif was so popular, and it's also related to the empire moving from the north to the south. When they moved to South China, and they sort of discovered the rice fields and the buffalo. So it's also related. If you want, I can show you some paintings. I don't know if we have time, but you're absolutely right. It was very popular in Song painting. Do you want me to show you one or two paintings?
Yes, please.
Yes, we have time. So
let me see. Just a second. Just a second. I'm sorry. Oh, here it is. Just one second. Please forgive me for taking so much time.
No, it's fine.
That's all right. Don't worry.
Okay, now let us do share screen. Okay, so here you see, for example, this is a southern song painting of a child mounted upon the buffalo, yes, It was a very popular motif. And you also find it in, you see the painting, yes?
Yes.
And it's also popular in 20th century painting. This is Li Keran, you know, the famous 20th century artist. So the love of the buffalo, it's buffaloes, not oxen. The love of the buffalo was shared. It's universal. Was universal in Chinese culture.
Thank you.
Thank you very
So
much. Some more questions or comments or?
Thank you.
No, then thank you very, very much for the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga.
Thank you.
So we have time for coffee break, and we will meet after the coffee break at, I think, yes, at 12 o'clock there will be 2 parallel sections. Yes, so people who want to go to section 6 about Japanese history and culture, they will stay here, and people who are interested in Mongol studies will go to another Zoom, and we will meet there. So once again, Tada Rabba Lecha.